Jenna, oh my God, we're talking to an Olympian today.
Nancy Hogshead Makar. I feel more accomplished just by association.
Right? Nancy made the Olympic swim team when she was just 18 years old, back in 1980. The U.S. was boycotting the games in Moscow that year, so she didn't have her chance until 4 years later in Los Angeles at the 1984 Olympic Games.
Another look at the Olympic Swimming Stadium on the campus of the University of Southern California. And there is the woman who is favored going into the women's 100-meter freestyle. 22-year-old Nancy Hogshead of Jacksonville, Florida, and Duke University. The story bears repeating.
This is the story of a woman who channeled her anger and pain into an Olympic victory.
But before Nancy became a 4-time Olympic medalist, the most decorated swimmer at the Games, I might add, she almost quit swimming forever.
Let's go back to 1983. You're a swimmer. Wait, scratch that. You were a swimmer. When you were a teen in high school, you were the best in the country, a national treasure. But even though you're 20 years old now, you've already kind of retired. But today, for the first time in almost a year, you're back at the pool. It's hot. 100 people are crammed into the bleachers to watch. Just show up, your coach told you. Just get in the water, he said. All right, why not? In spite of your retirement, your body remembers everything. Swimsuit in place? Check. Cap secure? Check. Goggles ready? Check. You shake it all out one last time for good measure. You feel every muscle in your body awaken. Your lungs begin to burn. But that doesn't stop you from crying. Your rage fuels every stroke as your tears blend into the water. Racing in the water, where no one can see your tears, helps you heal. You're almost done, and you start to make your way back to the finish line, where the real world and a cheering crowd awaits.
I've been really trying to take my self-care game to the next level this year, and part of my self-care routine is making sure my hair looks fantastic 24/7/365, because having fresh hair color is just one of those little things that does help me feel my best. But since I travel a lot, I don't always have time to spend hours and hours in a salon, and that's why I love Madison Reed. Madison Reed is reinventing the way women color their hair. It's the quality of salon color, the convenience and affordability of at-home hair color, and it's an ammonia-free formula with ingredients that you can feel good about putting all over your head. You don't have to sacrifice the quality of your hair color just because you're short on time. With Madison Reed, you can get gorgeous, Italian-made, multi-dimensional hair color delivered straight to your door on schedule for less than $25. And if you're worried about picking a color online, don't be. Madison Reed makes it super easy. Just answer a few quick questions about your hair and you'll be finding your perfect shade in no time. Head to madison-reed.com to find your perfect color today. iSurvivor listeners will get 10% off plus free shipping on your first color kit with promo code SURVIVOR. That's code SURVIVOR at madison-reed.com.
From Wondery,
this is iSurvivor. I'm Jenna Brister. I am a longtime stand-up comedian. I'm a screenwriter. And I'm also a survivor of domestic abuse. And I've survived 3 scooter taxi cab accidents.
And I'm Wagatwe Wanjuki. I'm a writer, I'm a speaker, and I'm also a survivor of campus sexual assault.
On our show, we tell you about the attacks, the assaults, the manipulation, the fear, and the triumphs. People who fought back, who won, and who live each day rising above the trauma of that experience.
We also spend a lot of time talking about how a single traumatic event can change everything in the blink of an eye.
And that's the case for today's guest, Nancy Hogshead Makar. She's a civil rights lawyer and an Olympic gold medalist. When she was a sophomore at Duke University, Nancy was jogging on campus when a man attacked and brutally raped her. And actually, Wagatwe, you have a personal connection to the story.
Yeah, so I'm one of the 1 in 5 women who are survivors of sexual assault during their college years. I was in an abusive relationship with a student, and it involved multiple instances of sexual assault. My assailant was very much into partying, and I checked out the scene as well. And for me, it was very much an alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. And I didn't even know that was a thing back then. So I didn't report right away because I didn't know it was rape. Like, it felt kind of weird, and I was thinking to myself, I was like, that doesn't feel quite right. And the sort of nuance, I guess, and complexity and thoroughness when we talk about sexual violence now, at least it's more thorough. So I actually didn't end up reporting for a few years.
So then what happened after you, I guess, decided inside, like, no, this was assault?
I decided to do something about it because, you know, the violence was escalating and he was just treating me really badly. Like, one time we were at a bar and he got kicked out because he was like threatening to kill me and like doing things like that, where I was like, all right, this is getting a little out of hand.
Yeah,
which shows
absolutely.
you like what you go through when you're like, oh, I guess now it's kind of serious. And like thinking about all the other stuff that happened, it's kind of funny that like my turning point was like, yeah, I guess being threatened to be murdered is kind of effed up. Let me handle that. And so I talked with a lot of people, advocates and experts, and I decided to report the abuse and everything that I went through. My school, I was a student at Tufts University at the time, and I reported. And unfortunately, the school, they pretended to support me. They said, yes, we'll help you. Like, no problem. We'll go through the judicial process, et cetera, et cetera. And they didn't do anything. I didn't get like academic accommodations or any of the things that you hear. They ended up expelling me while my assailant managed to graduate on time. But once I finally left and I found my voice and I started speaking up after being expelled, it just got a lot easier. And I think I helped to heal, and I connected with other survivors who had similar experiences. But what makes today kind of special, right? We're speaking to probably one of the few people I know who have had a positive experience with their institution after being sexually assaulted.
Well, a lot of institutions get it wrong. Sometimes they can get it right. In 1984, Nancy Hogshead Makar won 4 Olympic medals, 3 gold and 1 silver. But she almost never made it because of something that happened to her when she was a 19-year-old student at Duke University. Take it away, Nancy.
I really had never thought that rape could happen to, quote unquote, somebody like me. You know, I was out running, and it was a very common place to run. The big difference was on this particular day was the first day of Thanksgiving break. So what normally is a social run, and like it was like, hi, you know, it would just, were not very many people around. Like, I understood there was sexism out there in the world, but I just never thought it would affect me, that by being hardworking and smart and accomplished, that I could somehow escape. You know, give me a little slack. I was only 19 years old. So I was raped for 2.5 hours, and it was as humiliating and as degrading and as horrifying. I mean, I thought for sure I was going to die. I mean, he had me in the middle of the woods, and he kept telling me that if I didn't do X, Y, Z, he was going to kill me. And one of the things that he wouldn't let me do is shiver, and it was cold outside. I started to pass out. And if you've ever passed out before, you know how like the blackness kind of closes in on you. So that started happening, and I couldn't shiver. And it had been 2.5 hours, and I had done everything 17 magazine tells you to do. Like, I had told him I was pregnant. I told him I had venereal disease. I told him my mother loved me and tried to have him see me as a person. And yeah, none of that was working. I thought, like, I'm a goner. Like, I'm not going to get out of here, Nancy. Like, you've done every trick you know how to do. And I started to cry. And that was when, like, I could tell he liked it when I started to cry. And so I started crying more. And I would say he was gone in just a couple of minutes after that. And he turns to me. This is after like I'm completely gonzo. He says, you know, I really respect you. You know, and I said, don't do this to anybody else. And he said, you know, I won't. I don't believe him for a second, but right. But it was like what he really wanted over me was power. What he wanted was for me to be degraded. I mean, that was the purpose. It was not his own sexual gratification. You know, that was not what the game was about.
And you went to the school, right? Did you report the rape?
I did. And I couldn't find all my clothes, but I went back up to where the street was, and I wanted a car that was coming from one direction, not the other direction, because he ran off in one direction, and he kept talking about he was going to take his car and he was going to take me to another place. So I kept like running back when a car would come from one direction. Like, I would run back into the woods, and then I'd run out. So I finally found this car. He was alone, and I ran in front of the car. And the poor guy, he was complete, because I looked a mess. And it was only a couple blocks away from the police station. So I went directly from where I was raped over to the police station. You know, when I got there, it was like this huge, like, oh my gosh, I'm here. But I really had a talking to myself before I went there. Like, I was crying when I got in the car, and the guy was flipping out. I told myself, do not cry when you get in front of the police. You are going to be believed. And, you know, I look back like, why didn't I think I was going to be believed? I just think that's a common fear that all women have, is that people won't believe that it happened to them. And fortunately, they did believe me, and they were incredibly sensitive and nice and kind and solicitous. And, you know, these great big police officers, you know, I'm 5'10", so I'm no small person, but, you know, they let me like cry into their chest, and, you know, they talked about their daughters, and they couldn't find by themselves like where it happened. So we had to go back there later that night for me to help them identify where it happened. You know, they were like, we're so sorry, we're so sorry, we're so sorry.
The police never found her attacker. Nancy tried to go on and live like a normal student, but things just weren't the same.
I did see a therapist, and I have to say that was not the most helpful thing. I mean, you know, a little bit, but what, you know, this was 1981, so there was not a lot of consciousness. The term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, did not exist. But when I look back at like what my symptoms were, was a feeling of perpetually not being safe. Like, I could be in a crowd with lots of people and didn't feel safe. I had a really hard time sleeping. I was always like on high alert. And I had this very quirkish, odd behavior of, I used to check to make sure that the doors were locked over and over and over again. Okay, so imagine you're lying in bed, and you just checked the door maybe 5 minutes ago, and you have this compulsion to go check to make sure that the door is locked. Now you know it's locked, and you've already checked 5 times the night before and 5 times the night before that, and right, you know it's locked. But I still couldn't help it. I had to get up and make sure the door was locked and the windows were locked. And I'd go lie down, I'd be okay for like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes or something like that. So I know this is crazy behavior, right? And I felt embarrassed. I didn't know how to stop it. If I could rewind the whole healing process, shall we say, the one thing that I would do differently is I talked to myself when I was at the hospital, getting the rape kit done, and, you know, my friend came and picked me up from the hospital. So I had this talk with myself, and I said, Nancy, this is a bad 2.5-hour event, and you are not going to let this ruin your life. You are not going to let this impact you at all. You are going to pick yourself up, and you are going to be just fine. Don't let this guy have any power over you. And I have to tell you, that was the most damaging thing I ever could have done to myself, because I wasn't allowing myself any space to grieve or to heal.
You're right. I mean, and you're an athlete as well. And I think, do they call it positive self-talk? Is that what it's called? I grew up playing sports too. And I remember that's something that was almost ingrained in us as athletes.
Yeah, I just didn't have a lot of empathy for weakness in myself or in other people or in being hurt or needy.
What you're sharing with us like really strikes me, because it breaks my heart in the sense that like we internalize so much even before we become victims. And if we are, right, like so many things you've said, I've heard from other people, I've even tried to say to myself, don't let them change your life. Well, it changed my life. Yeah, it sucks, but that's just a fact. And denying that doesn't really help, you know?
Exactly. Right. So my theory now, and I'm not a therapist or a counselor or a mental health professional, but I just have my own personal experience. But my belief is that if you let yourself go down, it's like dropping a ball. The ball will bounce back up, but you got to drop it. You got to let that pain go. You got to like let yourself go down before you can come back up.
I love that. Holding space for yourself.
Holding space for yourself. Yeah, exactly. Right. What I have come to see is that my emotions, if I let them be, they'll let me be. If I need to grieve, let's say somebody died, or, you know, like I did need to grieve this very, very painful experience of having been raped. if I do that and sort of go with the flow, it's like when you're in the middle of grief, it's hard to imagine that you're ever going to be happy again, or that you're ever going to feel lovable or spontaneous or safe, and you will, right? But that's like an act of trust that going down, that you will come back up. But when you're in the middle of down, it doesn't look like it. One of the reasons why I agreed to be on your show, and one of the reasons why I talk about being raped back when I was 19 years old and I'm 56 right now, is that I didn't have a model for recovery. And so when I felt crazy and I was checking the door and I couldn't make myself feel safe, and I was worried is an understatement. I was terrified that I was always going to feel that way. There was no Allie Reisman who'd come forward and saying, I was abused, I was raped, and look what a great life I have. You know, I thought my future was going to be tainted and tarnished, and like I thought, you know, nobody was going to love me, that I wasn't going to get married, that I wasn't going to have beautiful children, that I wasn't going to have a professional life that meant something to me, that I wasn't going to be a member of my community. I wanted me, like at age 40, to come forward and say, you really can recover from this.
Duke was incredibly supportive after you reported being raped. What did they do to help?
Well, first, let me say that I really credit Duke University, and I give them so many kudos for recognizing that I was a kid, you know, I'm 19 years old, a kid who was just about to kind of lose it. And they saw that I really needed help. And so rather than being punitive towards me and being like, well, Nancy, why aren't you going to class? Or why aren't you getting enough sleep? Or why aren't you, right? They sort of took the pressure off me. So they let me redshirt. They dropped 2 classes, which doesn't even show up on my transcript. And then I didn't take those finals until after I got back from Christmas break. Normally I would have had to take them beforehand. I mean, a great example of how wonderful they were to me is it was hard for me to find a parking space where I didn't have to walk through woods. And especially being out in night air just gave me the willies. So I kept parking illegally and kept getting tickets. And so finally I went into the police station to go I just wanted to go pay my tickets. And instead they said, like, Nancy, what's going on here? And I explained to them, and I was like, look, I can't walk from there I need to park here. And so they gave me a special parking pass and didn't make me pay any of the tickets.
This is a university really responding to you and your needs.
They really did, yes. Every victim should get what I got.
And then you won Olympic gold. If every school would actually do this, you know, and make you feel safe.
And recognize, like, you know, a lot of times lawyers will ask me, like, what can I ask for? And I'm like, well, you got to find out what the kid needs. You know, you got to find out what the student needs to be able to stay in school and to be able to finish their degree. And, you know, it's going to be different for everybody, but absolutely, like, what do you need to stay in school? What do you need to be able to feel safe?
Okay, let's pause right here. This is a story of how Duke supported Nancy after being raped. When an institution fails to do this, Dr. Jennifer Fried calls it institutional betrayal.
She's a psychology professor at the University of Oregon. And institutional betrayal is what it's called when an organization or an institution betrays or causes trauma on the people who depend on it. Like when Wagatwe School didn't support her, or a church not reporting a predatory priest, or the Olympic Committee are examples of it.
Jenna, do you have a story of how an institution betrayed you?
I actually had an experience with it a couple years ago here in Los Angeles. I do stand-up comedy a lot of nights, and this was before the Me Too movement popped off, and I was doing a Saturday night show, but I didn't get up until towards the end of the show, and the 2 guys who were hosting it kept giving shots to the crowd, which is normal. You know, it was a Saturday night, everyone's getting loose, and I got up on stage to do my set, and I have this very funny joke that I don't do anymore, but Wagatwe, you can see me now.
Yes.
But you can tell I'm an A cup. I'm a 34-year-old A cup, and so I had this bit that used to crush about how when I turned 30, I woke up and realized that I will die having never been motorboated before, because there's certain things, you know, more well-endowed women experience that someone, you know, like me has not, and so and it had never happened, and so I'm on stage telling that joke, laughs, laughs, laughs. This really intoxicated frat guy jumps up out of his chair and charges the stage and screams out, "I'll motorboat you." And before I can do anything, and I'm just on stage alone, the hosts are off to the side. He comes in and he puts his arms up my shirt. And I was able to like lean back over the piano and kind of fight him off. And then I was in such shock because I never had a person rush the stage or try to touch me inappropriately. That's so odd. And so I finished my set. And so I had a meltdown in the car on the way home. And I just thinking, what in my life had led me to this? I'm here at this very notorious comedy club. There's people everywhere. There are other people on stage. What just happened? And so I emailed the owner, who's a female, and told her about it. And nothing happened, you know? But it was just so demoralizing, thinking you're just going about doing your not hobby, but like what you do is do that, and then to have someone just think that's okay to put their hands under your shirt. It was very strange. But at the time, you know, you're under the lights, you're in front of a crowd, a paying crowd. I went into everything's okay mode because I didn't want to freak anyone in the crowd out. And I'm like, fuck that. All of you should be freaked out.
Right,
I should be freaked out, and all of you should be freaked out that this is happening.
That sounds horrible. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. Nancy Hogshead Makar's story, sadly, is rare. She was lucky that Duke did the right thing and helped her after the attack. And eventually, she did get back into the pool. 7 months later, Nancy's coach told her that if she wanted to keep her scholarship, she had to start competing at swim meets again.
I'll have to say that training is one of the most healing things that I could have done at that time because it was a very safe place to do two things with abandon, which was, number one, cry. So you can cry under the water and nobody can hear you. You know, and you're doing something really, really, really physical. And also I could be angry. And I didn't know that this was a technique that I found out later is that what therapists will to have people do is like where you come out with a different outcome. When I was training, in my mind, I would fight with him, but this time I was the victor. So I had tons of anger that I could like use it to actually go faster. So it was a positive thing to get that angry. And I could do it over and over and over. I mean, we were in the water 4 hours a day. So I had 4 hours of fighting with this guy and like, you know, I had a giant knife and I was slicing his head off and blood was going everywhere and it was wonderful. And right?
Absolutely.
Like I didn't know that was like a thing, you know, but I just knew like it just felt good.
So the investigation to your Olympic coach came out more recently. You reported it in 2011, and I think he wasn't banned until 2013. But this was a common knowledge, right, for the Olympic swimming team that he was, you know, preying upon young women.
Right, yeah. So yeah, it was a very different dynamic than just flat out being raped, like grabbed and pulled someplace. This guy would sort of charm these very young girls, and to them, it was a quote-unquote relationship. This was love. He was going to marry them. And I think that's in my sport of swimming. Every sport has something about them that has these unique triggers for sexual abuse. And in the sport of swimming, there's just a lack of boundaries. And there's a culture where coaches, quote unquote, date their athletes. And my coach was like Exhibit A, Mitch Ivey. And, you know, what was unique about Mitch was he never denied it. Unlike Ariana Kukos, who's come forward recently and talked about her coach, Sean Hutchinson, they hid it, not Mitch. And so it should have been the easiest case in the world to get him out back. I mean, in 1997, ESPN's Outside the Lines did this huge story about him, and he got fired from the University of Florida for it because they recognized he was this, you know, major problem. But did United States Swimming lift a finger to protect the next athlete from him? No. Did he continue to abuse swimmers? Yes.
Terrible.
Awful. What the Olympic movement has done, well, actually, what the Olympic Committee has intentionally not done to protect athletes is truly criminal. It's really awful. You know, you look back on what they have known and remain silent about. It is an awful story.
Especially with everything going on with Larry Nassar. the former USA Gymnastics national team doctor. Yeah, there's just so much systematic denial of what's actually going on at the top level.
The Olympic Committee keeps talking about, oh, we're going to have this protection and that protection. And instead, we need to shift power over to athletes. And that's much more threatening to the Olympic movement because, the coaches and the administrators have been getting all the money and all the power. And people don't usually just give up power. So that's what I'm working on now is I run a nonprofit called Champion Women. You can go onto the website, championwomen.org. We're doing everything we can to make sure that the Olympic movement, the club sport movement, which is, we just got a statute passed called the Safe Sport Act, which gives the Olympic Committee and all the national governing bodies like USA Swimming and USA Taekwondo and gymnastics, et cetera, a legal duty to protect kids and to make sure that that statute gets implemented and to make sure that the necessary power structure changes happen so that the club sport movement, which is it's 8 million kids, it's about 16 million athletes.
Mm-hmm. And it has none of the infrastructure that it should have for how much money is going through there and how many kids are involved.
Yeah, they get about $330 million a year. So they absolutely should be making sure that that sports are safe. If anybody would like to report from the club and Olympic sport movement, and there's no statute of limitations, but go on to safesport.org, and that is a new entity that I was instrumental in helping craft, which is safesport.org is where you report any sexual abuse that happened in club or Olympic sports, and they do the investigation, and they hold the hearing, and they can ban that coach or that doctor or that administrator from ever being involved in sport again.
Wow. Sounds like my new favorite website.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, safesport.org. Yeah, just in the 1 year they've been open, or in the 14 months that they've been open, they've had 800 complaints. 80% of them have been within the last year.
Wow.
Yeah, 800.
Important work.
Very necessary. Vital. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and really inspirational, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, you guys. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for having this show. I mean, I just think when I was 19 years old, you would have been like penicillin. Just would have been so healing and soothing, and really, I thank you very much for having your show and for having me on. Thank you.
These days, you can do pretty much anything with just a few clicks.
Seriously, just the other night, I had an aloe plant delivered to my apartment in under an hour.
What? The options are seriously endless. But when it comes to hiring, things haven't always been that easy. Finding quality employees can be a really daunting process.
Exactly. Tons of applications to sift through, candidates without the right qualifications, endless job sites, the list goes on. But today, hiring can be easy, and you only have to go to one place to get it done. ZipRecruiter.com/survivor.
ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards. But they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience and invites them to apply to your job.
Yeah, ZipRecruiter is so effective that 80% of employers who post on ZipRecruiter, they get a quality candidate within the first day. With results like that, it's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is the highest rated hiring site in America.
And right now, our listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address, ZipRecruiter.com/survivor. That's ZipRecruiter.com/SURVIVOR. ZipRecruiter.com/survivor.
ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Wow, that's an incredible story from Nancy.
Hearing her story from, being so brutally raped and then becoming an Olympian really gives us a peek of what is possible for survivors when their communities actually support them.
Absolutely. And if we're giving not only a ton of money, but our time and our faith and a lot of our trust in a place, and then to have it betrayed when there are just so simple needs, like what she was talking about with the parking tickets. About all she needed was a close-up parking spot to her classes to her dorm. And it's like something as simple as that can make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. It's all the little things. I think every single thing counts when you're kind of rebuilding your life and like your sense of self. And so I think that is just like a lovely example that schools can do the right thing. It's the right thing to do. And why not? Right. Like you said, like these students are in their care. And they're supposed to be helping them be the best students that they can be and prepare for real life, quote unquote, out in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like that should be part of the regular protocol. I mean, first getting the actual due process, when you do come forward and name someone who has assaulted you, having that side taken care of, but then having your own side taken care of about what your needs are. And so you can keep learning and get an education and go to the Olympics if that's your thing,
There's actually policy about that. It's called Title IX.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Right?
Yes.
And Title IX is a civil rights statute. It is about 40 years old, and it guarantees equal access to education based on gender. To say that in layman's terms, it's more or less saying that, if a school gets money from the government, any sort of funding, if you can get financial aid there, college or whatever, you have to follow this federal law where you have to prevent sexual harassment or sexual violence, sexual assault, and you also have to respond to it properly. So there's different things that you have to do. And so it's acknowledging that being victimized has an impact on your life and has an impact on your educational capabilities, right? At least temporarily. And so thinking that, especially women, right? Women are assaulted more. So they consider that like sex discrimination. Schools are basically supposed to not make the impact of that assault also bleed into their academic lives. Clearly, that didn't happen with me. It bled into my academic life. I used to want to be a lawyer, and now I'm a podcaster. So, but unfortunately, a big part of it is that schools are not following it. They don't want to. There's these people who are covering things up. So thinking about Nancy's story where essentially they did the opposite of what happened to me, right? So Tufts didn't do any sort of academic accommodations. They didn't do any accommodations for where I was living. They didn't do any sort of hearing or anything with my assailant, no sort of judicial process or anything like that. And so all these hits and then I'm left by myself. And then they suspended me academically because I wasn't doing well. And I'm like, well, hey, I was raped, that I heard that has an impact on people. Maybe you might want to help. They didn't want to help. It just shows these two opposite ends of the spectrum. And it gives me hope that it's possible, right? Because Nancy's assault wasn't even recent, right? And people like to think, oh, things have changed. And back then, things are different. It's no, people knew how to do the right thing back then. I hope we can make her situation not an exception, make it the norm.
Yeah. And it is such bullshit because you wonder why these people are so afraid to help their students. Are you afraid that something's going to come out and your donors are going to stop donating or students are going to stop enrolling? Where I think having a proactive approach to stuff like this, because it's going to exist no matter what, whether they acknowledge it or not, campus assault happens. And either they can pretend like it doesn't, and then people will just blindly enroll.
Yeah.
And then something similar to what happened to you would go on.
I had no idea.
Or they're like, okay, we're all humans here, and let's figure out how to keep our students safe. It's mind-blowing to me how someone could be in a position of authority and not take it seriously.
It's really interesting. I think it has to do with our priorities, right? And also just how educated people are. Because for me, I also think the dynamics are a little bit different, right? With Nancy, she was assaulted by a stranger and she was out running. And with me, it was somebody that I knew and it was another student. And so I think especially if those different dynamics and they feel like if people always think it's about he said, she said versus looking at the full picture and looking at evidence or at least just not treating victims like shit. Point blank, I think, Dealing with survivors 101. Don't treat us like shit, please. I think that a lot of times they see it as a PR problem rather than, hi, I'm administrators of this campus, and this campus exists to educate students, and my job is to make sure that students can do their jobs of being students, and so if we are not holding assailants accountable, if we're willing to hold someone accountable for stealing a laptop.
There's something there with going back to aftermath at Tufts, knowing what you know now, about what's possible and then going back into like what you wish, would have happened. Like, what, can you even itemize a couple things that you were like, oh, I would have loved to be relocated, to a different dorm?
In retrospect, obviously I didn't wish they expelled me, right?
Oh, yeah.
I wish they, gave me academic accommodations, try to help me get back up to speed, to par,
Yes.
just guide me. I think I needed like a really hands-on advisor at first, and also just to be heard and for them to have followed their own process. They didn't even go through the whole judicial process of even if they said, okay, like there's not enough evidence, at least they would have tried. And I think that lack of trying and then the retaliation was just like it added insult to injury. And so for a really long time, I actually would talk about how Tufts treated me was actually way more traumatic than my assault. And that's probably like an unpopular opinion. I felt that this was another student who didn't know what they're doing, right? Or maybe they did, but like still part of it is that you're part of this community. We have adults that are supposed to be telling us what to do and how to be good human beings, right? Like respectable people. And it was their job to at least pretend that like rape is bad, like at least go through the motions. And I think that's what made it so like messed up. And so when I found Dr. Jennifer Fried's research, I saw that institutional betrayal actually exacerbates trauma. So community support is just so integral to recovering from trauma. And so how can somebody move forward if everyone's calling you a liar and isn't even acknowledging that trauma happened? Or if they do and they don't do anything about it, they're essentially just saying that like they don't care what happened to you, right? It felt like it was a reflection of my value to them or lack thereof. And I was already going off of that from my assailant, right? Because they already made it very clear, right? Like I was not valuable to them. So I think it's really important for us to think about these, like, the whole context. It's not about revenge or all these sort of things. I think it's just about practice what you preach, right? Like I chose Tufts because they talked about like civic engagement and like good citizens and, caring about human rights. And I see sexual assault, I see gendered violence as a human rights issue, and for them not even to act like that was really shocking. And because like that's why I chose that community. So for me to count on a certain type of support and not get it, it really threw me off. And I think that's why institutional betrayal really resonated with me when I found out about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because growing up too, we're taught these certain institutions are almost kind of blameless.
Kind of
like your principal. Yeah, I remember like we had a principal and he had this poster on his door. It was like Principal, and Pal was underlined. And I remember being like, yeah, okay, authority figures are all good. Mm-hmm. And we're taught that and we believe it. And I think that's, like you said, why it's so re-traumatizing, because you're again being forced to look at the way we understand the world and the community around us.
Definitely.
And it's very isolating.
Incredibly isolating, and trauma in and of itself is already isolating, right? So I think that's part of why institutional betrayal is so hard, because it just makes it worse, right? It just magnifies all the things you have to overcome when you're dealing with trauma. And that's why it's so important for institutions to actually do the right thing, right? And like practice institutional courage instead of betrayal, and to actually do their job. And I found that experience with Tufts also like really disappointing, because I totally relate to the whole thing with authority, right? Like I was taught that if you do the right thing, you follow the rules, you're a good person, you have good intents, like things will work out.
Yeah.
Wrong.
Wrong. Yeah.
Wrong. Thanks for that lesson, Tufts. I didn't get a degree, but at least you taught me that the world is shit.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even imagine, because I don't have children, but if I did and I was sending them off to school, it's like, what are those conversations like? Like, hey, here's Mace. You have to text me every night when you get back to your dorm. Like, it's insane what goes on campuses around America. It really is.
Totally. I think one of the best ways we can protect ourselves, I think, is by knowing about institutional betrayal, knowing that people are capable of this, knowing your rights, right? Like knowing about Title IX and knowing about the dynamics of trauma and sexual assault and like these sort of things, because at least in my case, I think they really did take advantage of the lack of knowledge about Title IX and the lack of clarity that was around with the policy. And so they used that to their advantage in the sense of like they wanted to cover their own asses. Or it's so interesting. Like, why do you want to protect an institution, right? Because it's sort of like you're working for this place, right? You're working for a school. Cool, right? But like, why are you working so hard and ruining like teenagers' lives to protect your employer who would post your job description on Monday if you called in sick too many times, you know, like for the last time on Friday? And that is really weird to me.
Yeah, what are they trying to protect?
Themselves?
Yeah. So Title IX is supposed to enforce that. And then in the case with Tufts, they didn't. So who enforces Title IX?
Oh, boy. Yeah, so essentially the Department of Education is supposed to.
Yeah. And do they? Are they good at that or are they bad?
Oh, boy. How many hours do we have to like dive into that? That should be a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
But essentially, the Education Department, right, the Department of Education, they're supposed to enforce it. But the weakness with civil rights statutes like Title IX is that the way it's enforced totally depends on who's in charge at the time. And so it isn't necessarily the same thing. And that's why institutional betrayal is so important for us to talk about, right? It's not just about like what's legal or not legal. It's about what's right and what's wrong and treating people with human dignity.
Absolutely. And how that expands to different things like with, you know, the Olympics or with like my experience at the comedy club.
Right.
You know, like they have their own private, not even corporate policies. I don't think they have policies, to be honest. And so nothing happened. You know, you can even raise a flag and be like, this is what happened. I have witnesses. This was going on. But there's no protocol. And especially in, I mean, with all the stuff that's going on with, obviously, in sports and in Hollywood. And, I mean, comedy, they haven't really scratched the surface even. I mean, obviously, Louis C.K. J-O-ing all over the place was not a good thing. But there's so much that goes on just in the nature of that industry. Yeah, it's terrifying. But
I mean, I think that's why it's so important to have policies, right? Yeah. Because as you said, like, how does anything happen if no one has a set procedure of how to deal with these sort of transgressions, right, when it happens? And so I think that places need to have their own policies and publicize them, make them easy to understand, and then also follow them once you have been putting them out there, right? You know, if they had a process for you to know whether they were following it or not, that is a sense of empowerment, right? Because you could be like, no, you're not doing what you said you would. And I think sometimes not having policies allows groups or institutions or whomever really to avoid culpability. Even if it's not intentional by everyone, things just going to fall through the cracks.
Absolutely. And by saying anything, people automatically treat you as, you know, difficult. Like, I remember, like, how many times, especially in the wake of all this Weinstein stuff, how all these actresses, that's how we would sabotage their career. Just saying, you know, oh, Ashley Judd is difficult, Mira Sorvino, difficult to work with, you know? And like, oh, we have so much to unpack in that narrative of all these women who have been labeled as difficult or as bitches. Like, even, I watched First Wives Club the other day. Amazing. Holds up.
Nice.
And Ronaldo, the guy who is like the interior designer. So that actor is on record saying that during filming, Bette Midler was difficult to the director. And I'm like, I would love to go back in time and see her just ask for a sandwich or a break for water. And all of a sudden she's difficult.
Right.
Yeah, you know, because the scope is so warped, you know, where it's like, no, just asking for, like you said, human decency and equal rights makes you a bitch.
It's such a weird double standard, right? Because like women can't stand up for themselves or even just be assertive, right? And then there's this, we're able to just derail women's careers just because of using the word difficult, which is so vague. And I don't understand. And how many times do we make excuses for other people, right? Like some of the powerful white men that got in trouble, right? Some of the powerful men and
who are still working.
Yeah, who are still getting jobs and stuff like that, right? Like it's just
Yeah, like if I assaulted a PA on the set of the Batman movie, I would not be working still. You know?
Right, exactly.
But because, you're this powerful white guy, he's still working.
And it's this weird thing where it's sort of like, how often do we hear about like, well, he's a genius or he's done this and he's done that, but it's easy just to flip that and be like, well, that woman is unhirable because, it's this really weird sexism that people use to get away with doing really horrible things.
Yeah.
That's why sexism sucks.
It sucks.
Just one of the many reasons.
Yeah.
Thanks again to Nancy Hogshead-Makehart for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode of iSurvivor. If you did, subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this right now.
If you're listening on a smartphone, tap or swipe the cover art of this podcast. You'll find the episode notes, including some details you may have missed.
You'll also find our email address there, iSurvivor@wondery.com, and links to our Facebook group and social media profiles. We'd love to hear your stories.
You'll also find some offers from our sponsors. You may have heard us mention ZipRecruiter in this episode. We love ZipRecruiter, and you can try it for free by going to ziprecruiter.com/survivor.
If you like this show, we'd love for you to give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review. This episode was hosted by me, Wagatwe Wanjuki, and Jenna Brister. Audio engineering by Sergio Enriquez. Sound design by Bay Area Sound. Produced by Leah Sutherland. Executive produced by Abby Fentress Swanson. Executive produced by Marshall Louie and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.